Welcome everyone to Mindful Parenting. I'm Christine Francoeur. I'm here with Dr. Al-Noor Mawani. Thank you for coming.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for being here tonight. Just going to introduce you a bit to Dr. Mawani. He works primarily in private practice. He's also an adjunct professor with the University of Calgary Department of Psychology. He consults to large private healthcare facilities in managing mental health issues in the workforce. He was previously a clinical psychology practicum training supervisor.
That's a mouthful.
And a Calgary, that was bad pasting on my part, and a Calgary clinical psychology residency program supervisor for 10 years. He has a particular interest in the use of mindfulness and acceptance-based treatments for chronic disease management, as well as various mental issues. He uses these skills in individual and group-based work, as well as presents to small and large groups on a variety of mental health, chronic disease, and wellness-based topics. So we welcome you tonight.
Thank you. Thanks. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So I hosted Dr. Mawani really in the spring, would have been, and we had a really lovely discussion. And at the end of that discussion, we both shared that we were parents, and he has a son and I have a daughter, and we got to talking about mindfulness in parenting, and well, here we are.
Yeah.
And so I said, would you be interested in coming back and maybe talking a bit more about that with our group? So originally we were supposed to have Dr. Alan Donsky with us tonight. He's a retired child psychiatrist, but unfortunately he couldn't make it. But next time we look forward to having him, but we're happy that you could join us. So tonight is a little bit of a different format than what we typically do. We thought we would have more of a panel discussion where I would bring some questions and some prompts to have good discussion. You could perhaps offer your thoughts. I mean, Phil, you can happily weigh in here too, because the principles of mindfulness as it relates to parenting or at work or even personally really does apply. So I think we can all weigh in with our expertise here, but we also want to hear from all of you. So we are recording tonight, just to make you aware, as we typically do. We won't be identifying you, but if you'd like to bring your questions and you're welcome, and add to the discussion, that would be lovely, because really we both would really welcome.
This is so much better as a conversation, right, than just a delivery or a dissemination of information, right? This is so much better as a conversation. So
That's right.
I would love that. I would love that. And it makes it more relevant to you, right? Because then you get to participate in that conversation. So yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. So I thought we would start. I wrote a couple notes, and I thought, parenting for me has been probably one of the most rewarding things that I have done so far, but probably also one of the most challenging things that I've done so far. There can be moments in my life where I think I'm actually incredibly mindful until my role as a mother comes on board, and then it's like, wow, that wasn't very mindful. And so at its core, mindfulness is really about being fully present and engaged in the now. And that can very much impact how we deal with our children. And there was a quote by Sharon Salzberg that she said about mindfulness, which was, it's the quality of attention that sees without getting caught in what it sees. And I was like, oh yeah, that about sums it up in parenting. Yeah, right? So it's the quality of attention that sees without getting caught in what it sees. So her definition really highlights that non-reactive nature of mindfulness. And yet when I think about myself as a parent, and I think that has been something that has definitely hooked me in the past, in those aspects of, what am I seeing, what am I hearing, and the impact that it has for me, and then I might be reactive. So it's coming from me versus maybe what's actually happening. So maybe you can give us your perspective on your thoughts around that non-reactive aspect of parenting.
Yeah, I mean, I'll pick up on something that you just said, right? Which is, it's probably the most rewarding thing and the most challenging thing. It's because we're so highly invested in our children, right? And I think for most people, it's probably the biggest investment that we have. And I don't mean monetarily, I mean like we give of ourselves, right? And so I think there's going to be so many different things that come in here, but I think I'll start with the idea that I think we ought not be surprised that it is so engaging because we are so invested, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that engagement and that reactivity is inevitable, right? I just think that we ought not be surprised when we find ourselves in a place where we're reacting, right? And so then part of the mindfulness piece, I think, starts with the observation that here I am reacting. And I can notice what I'm reacting to what's going on before me in an environment, but also reacting to what is happening within me, which brings so much, right? That is a part of me in this moment, is a part of my history, it's a part of, the memories that I bring forward into the moment. And I really do like this idea that mindfulness is an opportunity to create a space where I get to observe. Because in that space of observing, and if you just think about it, right, if I'm observing, I'm not necessarily sort of interacting with, I'm not necessarily engaged in that way, but yet at the same time, I am still engaged. So I'm observing myself, the environment, my child perhaps, or the family dynamic as a whole. I think that is a wonderful place to start with being present.
So when we're in those moments of observing and, where maybe it's a calm situation, but when it's like emotionally elevated or the child is, frustrated or angry, or, I'm constantly amazed at how a child can hold the line on something, like their ability to just again and again and again, so it's, how do we deal with the emotional response when it is so heated and charged, when we're observing that and yet we're hooked?
So I'm recognizing, like we started this conversation before we go, right? Like we talked a little bit earlier about what it's like to be a grandparent as well as being a parent, right? So I don't want to leave you out of the conversation, and I'm happy to hear your thoughts on that. I would actually start with the idea that in mindfulness, and sorry, if I can go back to the introduction, right? So we've got this idea of mindfulness and contentment. They're coming in to do this talk, because to some degree, I think mindfulness often gets attached to clinical endeavors, the mindfulness of stress reduction, right? What have you, right? I think we start with the idea that yes, mindfulness and presence in the moment is about acknowledging the moment the way that it is. That doesn't mean I'm going to actually do anything to change the moment. It doesn't mean that I want to make things go away or even start with the idea that I need to make this better. And I was mentioning to Phil earlier that one of the few people that I follow from a parenting perspective is Dan Siegel, right? So he's out of the UCLA, and one of the things that he has talked about is this idea that being present with your child in those emotional states, in those highly charged emotional states, might actually start with acknowledging that they are having an experience. So many times as a parent, we don't want to see our children struggle, and so we want to somehow get rid of it. You'll be okay, don't worry. No, how about we not start there? How about we start by acknowledging you're having an emotional experience? And you can even just start with, and Dan says this, right? You can even just start with the idea, oh, I can see that you're feeling something. Something's happening here, right? And then from there, you're actually inviting the child to participate and experience with you. And there are so many things that happen in that moment. So earlier we were talking about the importance of community, the importance of connection. You're inviting that child to connect with you by acknowledging their experience, not trying to change it, not trying to make it go away, just acknowledging what's happening in the moment. And there's a few other things that go from there, but I think that's where we can start in a mindful way with that child that might be having sort of an intense emotional experience in that moment. But the other part of it is that we also have to be present with ourselves, right? So we have a part of of our brains, whether you want to call them mirror neurons or, you know, the reflective piece, which engages in that experience, and we feel it with them. And in a mindful way, if we're able to acknowledge that for ourselves and observe that, we can use that to help our children better understand what their experience is. Not necessarily rushing in to label it for them, but just notice, oh, I'm feeling something too. And I'm feeling it, and perhaps because you're experiencing it. So I want to share that with you. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. A lot of sense, yeah.
Right?
Because, I mean, we're so, like, it goes back to your comment about how invested we are. Right? And,
Right.
you know, our heart goes out to them, but then it's also that feeling of this elevated state. And yet, as a parent, though, you know, we think about mindfulness, and there is this invitation for non-judgment. Mm-hmm. And yet, it feels like typically parenting feels, oh, judgment a lot of times, you know, that we are supposed to be the wise ones guiding, offering this. And yet, you know, they're in this, could be an emotional state, but you know, there's still critical thinking here as a parent, and you understand, you know, what I'm bringing up here. But how are we able to be with that in a way that still feels present and caring and loving and has boundaries and all the things that maybe is needed, and yet is releasing that sense of non-judgment?
Right.
What are your thoughts on that?
So I know I have my thoughts. I feel like I'm leaving out of the conversation, so
No,
please.
you go ahead, and now I can comment after you do it.
Okay. I'm going to start with something that John Kabat-Zinn often reinforces. Non-judgment is not the same as not having judgments, right?
Yes.
And so it's not that we're supposed to not have judgments, which would be a judgment in and of itself, right? So I think this is where I go back to acknowledging my part of the experience. And I'm having a judgment here, whether it's I like this or I dislike it, I agree with it or I disagree, whatever that judgment might be. I'm acknowledging, okay, here I am having my part of this emotional experience, and I'm having a judgment. But then, if I can, and this is going to bring up another point, but if I can drop into that moment for myself, and I do think that a part of mindfulness as a parent is about regulating one's own emotions. This is part of that structure, right? I can then acknowledge that this is a part of me. My child is having an experience as well. I can acknowledge, therefore, that I am also having some judgments about that, but I can clear some space, which I think is the idea of setting aside some of those judgments. This is the setting aside, this is the non-judging part, so that I can clear some space for us to have this experience together. That does not mean, just to go back to your point, that does not mean that this experience is boundless. It doesn't mean that everything goes and you get to throw tantrums and throw things. No, that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is just acknowledging that you're having an experience. And of course, depending on the age of the child and their developmental stage, we're going to need to put different boundaries in place. And we can get into that at a later point in time. But to start with that idea of, okay, yes, non-judgment and mindfulness, but that doesn't mean I won't have judgments, or I'm not supposed to have judgments, or I'm doing something wrong if I do, but more so that I start by acknowledging that I am. I start by acknowledging that these are a part of my judgments, but if I can create some space for them and set them aside, I create this space where I get to experience this with my child. It could also be with my partner. It could also be experiencing as a family.
Yes.
Right? And the other point that I just wanted to bring in here, sorry Phil, I keep telling you that.
No.
Because I think we often focus on those peak sort of high emotional moments. But I actually often tell the parents that I work with, it starts in times where it's calm. That's where you lay the groundwork. Mm-hmm. When your child is having that really intense emotional experience, that is not a teaching moment, right? Their brain is not ready for it. That is not a teaching moment. That's an experiential moment. And by experiencing, we are teaching in some respects. But that's not a teaching moment, right? It's in the spaces in between those moments that we actually want to be engaging and participating and, asking our children, like, what's going on for you? And inviting them to be present with their own experience, showing that we can be present together with those experiences. That's where the groundwork that you can then sort of lean on when you're having those moments. Does that make sense?
And it does. And it's then when that invitation has been given to them, you know, to speak and to offer that, then I think that, you know, falls on the parent to be able to really listen, you know, without taking away what they've offered or trying to shift it or fix it, but to let the truth of their experience be said, you know, whether we want to hear it or not. You know, I've had those moments with my daughter where she can lay some truth bombs on me and I'm like, you're absolutely right and I'm very sorry about that, you know, and I'm not afraid to apologize to her. You know, I don't carry this, like, the burden of being right. And I mean, that's what mindfulness has taught me, is that there's space to make mistakes in a relationship.
And I think for perhaps later on in the conversations today, that's where compassion comes in.
Yes.
Right? The compassion for others, the compassion for oneself, which is often very hard, right? But that, if I can cultivate some of that compassion for myself, I create some space for myself to, oh yeah, right, that probably didn't go the best way or whatever, right? I forgot my shoes, it left my mind, right? I give myself some compassion to be able to have those moments and to be human, right? And I wanna bring Phil in here because earlier we were talking about something else, and I'm gonna put a label on it.
Okay.
And that is, as a grandparent, maybe not just as a grandparent even, but there is a wisdom, right? Like you almost develop a wise mind.
That's debatable.
I mean, there's a lot of pressure.
You know, I think we have to go back to the basics. And the basics is, what is mindfulness? And so when you hear that word mindfulness, what comes up? What's the first thing you know about mindfulness?
Being present.
Exactly. The problem with that definition is it is not expressing what mindfulness is truly all about. You need to be mindful. If I'm not aware of what I am experiencing in the moment, I can't do anything with it. But the real essence of mindfulness is not being aware. It's what you do with what you know. It's how you are in relationship with the moment. That's the critical aspect of mindfulness. What do they say? Be accepting, allow, non-judgmental. So the big question then is, and you can share, I think we distort the definition of mindfulness. It is not just about being present. You cannot have mindfulness without wholesome, skillful behavior. John Kabat-Zinn in 1979, when he introduced MBSR, gave us contemporary understanding of mindfulness that reflected his Korean Zen Buddhism understanding. And you know what he meant by non-judgmental? Non-duality. What does that mean? There's no separation between subject and object. But if you read his explanations about non-judgmental, that's what he talked about. Forget non-duality. We're not going there. So that's the first question. What is mindfulness? It's not just being present, it's how you are in relationship with the present moment. Then the next question comes, and this is the core. You're not going to be non-judgmental. You know what the essence of that is, as I think? Non-self-referential judgmental. That's the crux of freedom in mindfulness. Hard to understand, but we create a sense of self moment to moment based on our inner child woundings. And this moment triggers my sense that I'm not good enough. And I create a new sense of self that's different but similar to what just existed. So non-judgmental means, I think, understanding your core inner child woundings and see how that manifests moment to moment. So the two questions for you are, what is mindfulness? And two, how are we present from a non-self referential moment. Because here's what happens. The biggest problem we give to our children is, you know what? They are living the legacy of my unfulfilled expectations. Here's my mom, came to Canada before the Holocaust, lost her father at 2, never got over it. Everything had to be safe and perfect and controlled. Simple. All I learned was just be perfect in order to be loved. And that gets reflected moment to moment. So what is mindfulness? And how do we spare our children from the legacy of our conditioned historic pattern of inner child wounding?
Okay, that should about do it. It's just no small thing.
I don't know that I can answer that question.
Okay. Now, why is that?
Because it is so complex.
Where's the Reader's Digest?
I don't see a way that I can just give you a 3, 5, 30 hour version of that.
So maybe.
So here's what I will say though,
Okay.
if that's okay, here's what I will say.
Sure.
We were talking about this earlier.
Mm-hmm.
This is going to be my opportunity to bring in self-compassion. That to some degree, it is a part of our life's journey to better understand what you would call a legacy, what that legacy might look like.
Mm-hmm.
And so as you evolve and as you come to an understanding of what that legacy might be and what you bring from your parents, what you evolved from your parents and what you might be experiencing with your children, through your children perhaps. Your awareness of that, I will agree with you, that behavioral piece is very important, and I'm going to touch on that in a second, but how you translate that into how you interact with your children, and that interaction is not just behavioral, the expectations that you hold, the way that you guide them, the things that you tell them, that then I think can be one of the ways that we can help them to better understand what is inevitably going to be my interaction with them and what you might call a legacy.
Mm-hmm.
So that they can then perhaps not have to live my legacy. So it starts with my awareness of that. But then that compassion piece, I think, comes from, okay, so if I can be compassionate with myself, if I can hold that, if I can allow myself to be that human being, I can then impart that to my children, to my child, so that they can then also not be encumbered by it. Because they now know that I'm aware of it, and I'm doing the best that I can. And I truly don't think that neither mindfulness nor compassion asks us to be better than who we are and who we can be. That's a part of our development, and we need to engage that actively. But you use the word perfectionism, right? I can't be perfect. I can't be. It doesn't matter if anybody expects me to be. I can't be. So how about I just let that go? I'll be the best person that I can be. I'll be the best version of me that I can be. And that in part means that I'm also going to share that with my child and try my best to not necessarily tell them all my foibles and this is all my problems. No, that's making my child my therapist, right? But to be aware of how I might be translating that and then say, look, you know what, you don't have to worry about that. That's me. That's mine to deal with.
Right. But I do think there is value. I think mindfulness, there's so much we can learn from the East, and there's so much we can learn from the West. And I think it's the integration of the two that is the most powerful. I think that in understanding what our core woundings are, and we all can do that, as long as we're not too traumatized so that we don't trigger our re-traumatization. All of us knows what we lacked in our childhood. All of us knows what we wanted. And that doesn't give society free rein either. But I think it is important in understanding why you do what you do based on those woundings. So that in the moment, or maybe not even in the moment, when there's time and space, you can relive the moment and say, okay, what went on there? What triggered me in that moment? What is calling to be heard? And that's giving it visibility. And that's a way to start to deconstruct the sense of self. I always look at it as enrage and outrage. You do something that I don't like. What do? How could he have done that? Outrage. I'm angry at him for what he has done. The bottom line is we superimpose value on everything. The critical aspect is not to look at him and say, the critical aspect is to look at me and say, what's being triggered in me from my wounding? And then what's being triggered in him? And so this is a way I think that we can be in relationship with our children and maybe not pass our legacy to them. You know, my son's my best therapist. He's, what is he now, 34? He lets me know what I offered him in his childhood. So what do you think mindfulness is, Al-Noor? Is it just being aware in the present moment? Or is it not being non-judgmental? And how do we accept? How do we let go? How do we let be? It's one thing to say it. You can't will it into existence.
No, yeah, it is very much a practice.
But so how do you do it? How can these people go home tonight and say, at least this is a way I know I can start to let go of my anger at my child for what they did, or my boss or my partner?
So I think there are multiple layers to this, right? And I think sometimes we start at this layer, sometimes we start at this layer. We're talking about legacy, that's an outer layer. And so if you're going to ask me what I would offer, I would actually start with some of those basic principles. You're right, it is not just being present. It is also not just being aware. I think it is also a whole bunch of other things. But doing some of those things is very hard. I mean, I think when I think of it, you have to boil it down to practicalities. What am I going to practice in this moment? And I do start with, let me be present, let me be aware, let me be acknowledging of the moment that I have. And then from there, I can construct out, I can build out. What do I want to be aware of? What can I be aware of? Okay, well, let me be aware of myself, let me be aware of the people that I'm with. Let me be aware of both what I'm bringing to this moment, but also how they are influencing this moment and what they might be bringing to this moment. There is a practice of non-judgment. I go back to those basics. So there is a practice of non-judgment. There is a practice of being aware of those judgments. There is a practice of turning inward and being able to observe those things that my mind is creating, those things that my mind is remembering, those things that my mind is connecting. Because that is also shaping how I'm seeing the moment as it evolves right now. It is shaping how I'm perceiving. It's shaping how I am interpreting. And it is shaping what I then do with the moment next, how I engage it, whether I choose to react or respond, whether I am going to react based on emotions or react based on what is going on around me, what your behavior might be. I think this is where it starts. And then it gets very hard to predict what I can offer you, because then it's sort of like, okay, well now you got to tell me what you're doing, and then I can say, okay, let's build out from there.
Mm-hmm.
So when I think of it, I'm simple. When I think about it that way, I try to keep it simple.
Great. Yeah.
Right? I try to keep it simple that way.
Do you think that there's the opportunity then when we look at our awareness within that, you know, like what you're offering, how do you think that impacts like the relationship with the child? Like, I mean, obviously it's dependent on age and, you know, their maturity levels, but, you know, do you believe that there's like an opportunity through our own modeling that we're actually able to create a different way of being for them? Have you seen that, or in your practice, or even in your own family? What have you noticed?
Sure, I actually think that is a really sort of, I would call it critical.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that your ability to be present, your ability to be mindful in that presence, your ability to be aware is very much a modeling for your children. And it's often much to a parent's chagrin that we understand that our kids learn from what we do, not what we say. And so what we do then carries so much weight, right? And they see us being or discompassionate towards ourselves. They see us berating ourselves. They see us not being present sometimes even. And so this might be one of those avenues where that legacy comes in, but also I think that's where the humanity resides. And so if I can then practice, if I can then ground myself, and sometimes literally it is a grounding. I put my feet on the ground and I feel the ground through my feet. I am modeling something, I am teaching something, even though I am practicing something for myself. And it's just one of the reasons why one of the things that I start with when I'm working with parents is, okay, so we need to start by regulating ourselves. Because that then becomes something that I am teaching, even though I'm doing it myself.
Last time you were here, you had a beautiful practice where you led us through mindfulness, where it was like, don't change a thing. Just exactly as you're saying, can you bring mindfulness? Would you mind just quickly, for the next couple of minutes, offering that practice again for those of us here to, because I think sometimes we think, oh, well, I gotta straighten my spine and you know, but actually that can't always be the case when we're in it. So I thought that was a beautiful practice.
Yeah, so don't move, except to breathe. Please do breathe. And if you do feel the need to move, that's okay. Just acknowledge that to yourself. Acknowledge that there is something within you that you are saying, okay, this is going to cause me to want to move. That's fine. And then be deliberate about the movement. But for right now, don't move. And just drop into this moment. And what I mean by that is connect with the chair. Connect with, if you have a foot on the ground, or both feet on the ground. And I'm stopping talking because I don't want you thinking about it. I want you actually experiencing it through your senses. And just, if you will, take stock of where your body is. And you can do that by going from head to toe or toe to head. You can do that by taking different limbs and torso and arm. Just take stock of where your body and what your body is communicating to you right now. And just notice that in doing that, you are observing that. Also notice that you might get distracted, you might leave, you'll have other things, memories, plans. Just notice that, it's okay, that's what the mind does. I'm just going to set that aside for a moment and come back to the body. Come back to that place in your body that you last had contact with it. And notice that you can also create a space where you allow whatever it is that you find. So there could be comforts and there could be discomforts. And even while I'm talking, just stay there. Just allow me to guide you, but don't have to listen to me. I like to run little experiments. So at a moment of your choosing, you might just move one part of your body. It could be an arm, it could be uncrossing your leg, whatever it is that you choose. And just notice how that changes the sensations, changes what the messaging is that's coming from your body. And just notice what that message is. It's not necessarily better or worse, although you might hear yourself making those judgments. Just notice what that message is. But tuning into those sensations, tuning into what my body is telling me right now. And then, at a moment of your choosing, taking a deep breath and using that to bring yourself back to the room, back to this group, and back to our conversation. Something like that.
That's exactly. Some thoughts on that? Does anyone want to share how that was for them?
I have a question. You said to find a place for X, Y, Z. How would you describe that process? And what is that place to you?
So just so I can be clear,
Yeah.
finding a place for X, Y, Z, are you talking about the judgments that you make? Are you talking about something else in your experience?
Well, for your conversation, you talked about finding a place for, trying to remember what you would call it specifically, but
Yeah.
Yeah,
Let me talk about it in both respects.
Yeah.
Finding a place for the experience the way that it is, and that's right here.
Mhm.
So whatever experience I'm having, it's right here. And I might notice that floating around that are some judgments about it, whether I like it or dislike it, whether it's good or bad, whether I should be having it or not having it. But whatever that experience that I'm having, that place for it is right here, in my mind anyways. The way that I think about it. And I'm glad you actually asked that, because, and then the judgments that I have about it, whether I think it's good or bad, or whether I like it or not, or whether I should be having it or not be having it, I don't want to send them away, I just want to clear a little bit of space. So sometimes I'll use, the analogy of you've got oil floating on water, and then you drop a little bit of dish fluid, and it just sort of disperses that oil a little bit. So the oil, it's still there, it's still, but you've got this space now that you've created in the center, where you can just see a little bit more clearly, not perfectly clear, just a little bit more clearly. Oh, this is what I can see through it now. So I'm trying to sort of just create this space where I can have my experience, and then there are certain pieces of it that I might just sort of say, okay, that's clouding my experience right now, and so therefore I'm just going to set that aside, or not have to tangle with it right now, not get engaged in it. And I'm glad you brought that practice up, because in some respects what I was inviting you to do when I was inviting you into your body was I was actually inviting you to your emotional experience, because this is kind of where your emotions are, right? And inviting you to accept whatever it is that you find there, whether it be calm or turmoil. Does that make sense?
It does. I was just asking because as an adult child, only recently started meditating, and recently on my journey as an adult child since March, I don't know what is in. I don't know how to identify what's in there yet. I have very little recognition. So.
Can I just say, notice that too,
Yeah.
right? Notice that too, is that, oh wow, I don't see a lot. Okay. Because I actually think sometimes you'll see a lot, sometimes you see a little. You're looking. You're looking. And create some space for that, if that makes sense.
And the other valuable thing, I think that was really fantastic practical advice for all of us, is to be with our experience through our bodies and not our heads. Because instantly, you know what we do, right? We proliferate. I'm bad, this is terrible, how could they have done that? And so the first thing that can be helpful to ground you into your body is to label your experience. It's the way to bring awareness to what is happening. Now anger, now sadness, now a thinking, now a judging mind, pain in my leg. So the first thing you can do is label and name your experience as a way of bringing awareness to the moment, anchoring into the moment, getting out of your head, and actually helps to support not identifying with your sense of self. Because in order to label what's going on, you have to step out of being what is happening. And then, fantastic, go to the body. Because our thoughts and our emotions are expressed physically, right? How do you know a thought? We can hear it, we can see it, we can feel it. How do we know an emotion? We feel it. So those are two practical things. Name your experience and feel it in your body. And stay with it as long as you can, because you know what's going to happen to every experience you have?
What?
It'll change.
It's going to end. There's a neuroscientist, Bolt was her name. I can't remember the name of the book. She had a stroke. A stroke of insight.
Oh, yes.
And how long did it take for any experience, without adding anything to it, to pass away? At its longest, 90 seconds. And I think that's way too long, I tell you that. So stay with it until it goes. Isn't that amazing? And all that. So that's a great reminder that Al-Noor gave you about how to deal, how to be with what you experience.
And actually, I really like that from a parenting perspective too. I want to bring that back to, because being able to stay with it teaches your child that they can stay with it too. If you can be present with it, and in some respects this is a bit of therapy too, right? Like you know, being present with another person when they're having an emotional experience, especially one that they're scared to have. And yet, if you can be here with me, then maybe I can handle it a little bit. Right? And so we're teaching our kids too that if, oh, look, I'm not going anywhere. I'm staying right here, and I'm having this experience with you. Not even just jumping into labeling it, but eventually I want to, because then I can create some of that distance, as I started out with, right? Like you can just even acknowledge that something is happening right now. And then experiencing it in your body and allowing it to stay, not needing it to be pushed away, creates a sense of confidence. And to some degree, this is from a neurobiological perspective, this is where resilience might come in as well. That child learns not to be afraid of their own emotions and not to be afraid of their own experience.
So how do you get the child, what do you say to the child or ask the child for them to start to learn to be mindful of their experience? What do you say to them?
So I often remind the folks that I work with, I'm not going to tell you what to do. So this is not me telling you what to do. But I'll go back to something that I was mentioning to Christine, and that is, I think sometimes we focus on those sort of really intense emotions, when really it's the stuff in between. And so I would love to invite a child in those moments to experience a moment. That's where I think it would start. And, you know, again, getting practical, there's two things. One, Dan Goleman. So he's got, if you don't think badly of me on this, we actually have his CD in our car. He's got a mindfulness for kids. And he's got, I think, 4 or 5 different tracks where he just sort of guides a child through a mindful practice that is sort of very kid-friendly, very kid-oriented. And so at a practical level, you know, you don't have to do Dan Goleman, but there's lots of different versions out there. In my office, I have a deck of cards, and it's a mindfulness for kids deck of cards. And so, you know, when I'm working with a child, and I'm doing some mindful practice with them, I'll just display the cards and I'll say, okay, just pick one. And then we'll do that practice together. So that's the other part, we do it together. And there's another thing, I know we're running out of time here, but there's another thing that I really wanted to just touch on. And that is something that you did touch on earlier as well. The importance and the essence of mindfulness being one of relating, and we're in connection. Like, we do this together. I really think that's really important too. It's about the relationship, it's about our need to connect, and being aware of that and facilitating that. And so, you know, I want to do it with my child, or, you know, a child. That's how we invite them to experience. And I have yet to meet a kid that didn't eat it up. Like, really, I mean, obviously it's not going to work for every child, but it really, I think it also comes back to how you introduce it. And it doesn't have to be, as you mentioned, right? It doesn't have to be, in my mind anyways, you know, levitating yourself 3 feet off the ground in perfect lotus position with thumb and middle finger pressed perfectly together. That's not where we live, right? And so it doesn't have to be that. It can be, and I've invited some parents to do this as well, get down to ground level and build the Lego with them. You know, and don't try to take control of the Lego, let them build it. Right? And why'd you put that piece there? Just be curious with them. And then hear what they have to tell you. Hear what they have to tell you. I don't know if that was answering your question, but...
Does anybody here have questions that they would like to ask Al-Noor?
Or any of us.
I do have a question for Dr. Bernstein.
Good morning.
I have a question for you.
Sure.
You mentioned, well, you said, I just need to be perfect to be loved.
Yes.
How did you work with that? And after you realized that's your internalized belief, and you got compassionate with it, what's the next step? Is there a next step?
So,
Can you repeat the question?
I think the question is about identifying my wounding and how I worked with it. And so, like most of us, I think I came to mindfulness because I didn't want to have as much stress. That was the original reason why I came to it. I've always had a mind that has been a seeker, inquiry, looking for answers. And I became more and more aware of the impact of inner child wounding and how really it is, to a large degree, the foundation of how we create our sense of self. I began to appreciate that every moment that we experience is being referenced against how I believe I should behave moment to moment. Am I better than, less than, or equal to this person? As I said, I understood it. It took me a long time to understand why my mother was the way she was. But it became obvious, she lived a legacy of losing her father, losing family, leaving her country. And I was living her unfinished history. And I think that's what happens as a parent. This is what our kids contend with, living their parents' unfinished history. And this goes on moment to moment. And so I began to become aware of my history. I identified it. And I would work with it. And I would just spend time, when I had time, in private. God, I got angry at Joe today. What went on there? And can I see how my wounding was triggered in that moment? I did a lot of inner child dialogue. This communicating, very simple. I'm so angry. Why are you so angry? Well, because he did that, and that's the wrong thing. Why is that the wrong thing? And it always spins down like a toilet draining to the core. And so as I became more and more understanding of what my wounding was and how it was triggered, I began to see, hey, this is how my sense of self is being created. And what I realized, they say, let it go. What you're trying to do is let it let go, allowing my inner child to let go of its wounding. And that gradually became more and more of what was happening. As I could stay with the suffering and the pain, like any child, wait a second, Al-Noor's with me. I'm not as scared, I'm not as frightened. And I began to let go on and on of my story. And so now at times, and not enough, but way more times, I'm very conscious of my mind talking to me. Terrible was my mother's word. I've inherited that word. This is terrible. I am terrible. And now what happens, it's just words with no energy that flow through my consciousness. Not all the time. I'm triggered, but less often, less intense, and I come back to normal. So I think in understanding your childhood wounding, you have the capacity to see how you create the sense of self, because every moment is referenced. You begin to hold it, and it begins to let go. And so that you're able to just be present without having to compare every moment against your sense of feeling inadequate. And so there really is a sense of calmness that begins to come. You're less reactive. I have a dear friend who is very reactive. I'm not reacting now. That must be a good sign. I hope that answers the question. It's a lot of work. It's taken a long, long time. By no means is it perfect, but I can honestly say mindfulness and meditation has made tremendous difference. And I think we evolve from this is stress reduction to being in a skillful relationship with the present moment to resting in a non-self-referential space. And that space is really one of a lot of peace and calm. Do you have any ideas about that, Al-Noor, in terms of how do we deal with our woundings in order to help us survive what we pass on to our kids?
I mean, I think you just did a nice job of describing part of that journey. It is a journey, and then, as I said earlier, it's sort of like your life's endeavor, right? But I don't mean that to say that that ought to be your career, right? It's a part of your journey, and I think it where mindfulness can be helpful in a lot of different places in there, but one of those places can be that awareness, where I become aware of what I'm carrying and where I carry that from. You know, what you were describing in terms of that inner child, in therapeutic language, we would call that schemas, right? And so we become aware of these schemas that we carry, and we become aware of how these schemas can be maladaptive. That's using very clinical language, but still. Because once I become aware of it, now I have a little bit of an idea as to what I'm grappling with. I may not know all the different places where the tentacles strike and go reach, right? And this is where sometimes I can be surprised the way that I'm triggered, right? It's like, oh boy, I didn't expect that one to come up there, right? But again, there becomes learning, right? It's like, oh, okay, so then what you do, you just take a step back and you give yourself a chance. You can set aside the judgments of yourself, oh, I'm a bad person, I should have done that, whatever, right? Yeah, no, I'm a human being, right? Doesn't excuse behavior. That does not mean that we excuse behavior. And in the world of compassion, this is really important, right? Compassion is not about laissez-faire, everything goes. We're not excusing behavior, but what we are doing is reflecting on behavior and better understanding it, building our awareness, using that experience to help build our awareness. And asking questions like, where did that come from? Right? What was I responding to? Because it wasn't Joe, right? Or if it was Joe, that was only a part of it, right?
I have a very controversial statement that I want you to reflect on. Action is not always skillful. Intentionality for why we act is always personally skillful. Okay, get that? In other words, my intent to act is based on my inner psyche wanting me to be safe, loved, and worthy. So every time your mind speaks to you and says, this is terrible, your mind is trying to tell you something that's skillful. What do you think?
Say that again, Phil, about the intention aspect of it, just for...
Every time your mind is speaking to you, you know, I want to say this to Al-Noor. I want to act this way to Christine. This is your mind taking the current experience. How is it triggering me? What do I need to do to feel safe, loved, and worthy? So the intentionality for what your mind is saying to you and what it wants you to do and speak is personally skillful. It may not be skillful in terms of what I say to you or do to you or how I treat myself. But I think the intentionality for everything we do, that may be a bit absolutist, is skillful. What do you think, Al-Noor?
If we can take away the absolutes, yeah, sure. I think that I think that the intentionality with which my mind is trying to communicate, what it is intentionally trying to communicate, is very much grounded in those multiple components.
Right.
I would say, I don't know if this is answering your question, but I would say I want to hear all of that.
Right.
I want to hear all of that. Because I learned from that.
Yes. So the reason why I said that is, don't look at your inner voice as a negative. Look at your inner voice as a friend, as an advisor, as a protector.
And I would expand on that and say, I have said this frequently to the folks that I work with, I don't want to make an enemy of me,
Yes.
right? I don't want to make an enemy of me. I don't want you making an enemy of you. It's so easy to do that, right?
There's the question.
So clarification, because of the second comment. So if you could kindly explain what you mean by skillful, what is skillful?
And she's looking at you.
Oh, she looking at me?
You mentioned it,
Okay.
what is skillful and what is then personally skillful?
Well, skillful, and this really comes from, I guess, a Buddhist understanding. Skillful is different than ethical or moral. Because ethical and moral is a personal viewpoint, a personal perspective, right? When women shouldn't vote, that was the way it was historically, right? Now they've given the vote. So morality is not skillful. I think skillful enters into those general ideas of friendliness, respect, non-harming, compassion, generosity. Number one, I think that in a general sense is. And I think the key thing for me, and I'm sorry, I'm giving you a very biased Western psychological perspective here. We think and we act to meet unmet self-referential needs. And so that's why it's very important to simply say to yourself, wait. W-A-I-T. Why am I talking? Why am I thinking this? Why am I trying to do this? It's a great way to look at intentionality before action, speaking or moving. And what you want to really look at is, am I speaking or acting because I'm meeting an unmet personal need? Or am I acting because of, is it skillful? Because mindfulness cannot exist unless it is wholesome. Bottom line.
I'll tag on a story to that.
Please.
So this was a story that comes out of a book that I was reading a long time ago now, so I won't even remember the title of it. But it was a book essentially about mindfulness and family therapy, mindfulness and couples therapy, and the author was saying that, you know, if we were to just build it on awareness and leave out the action part, it is not mindful to knowingly beat your partner. That is not mindful. That is not the heart of mindfulness. It's aware. You can be aware that you're doing it, but that is not the heart of mindfulness. Right? So that idea that we talked about earlier in terms of there has to be this translation. This translation, and you know, some people would say that mindfulness is heartfulness, right? There has to be this translation of the intent, the awareness, to be kind, generous, to be compassionate, and that has to translate into the behavior. Behavior that we engage with others, so we can be partners and parents, right? But also the behavior to oneself. right? And we're quickly out of time here, but
No,
you know,
we've got plenty of time.
perfect, because this is where I think some of the research around, you know, compassion comes in. You know, her name will come to me in a second, I'm sure. but-
Kristen Neff.
Kristen Neff, thank you. So University of Texas talks about how in her research, she's done this with, you know, tens of thousands of people now, talks about how 75% of people report that it is far easier to be compassionate with somebody else than it is with oneself. Right? But to go back to your earlier point about being with your children and how to teach, they watch us not being compassionate with ourselves.
So Christine, you talk a lot about compassion. Can you share with our group here, if it's so hard to be compassionate to ourselves, as Al-Noor says, how do we be compassionate with ourselves?
That was a valid question. I had that as one of my things, that it's often challenging to extend that acceptance, love, forgiveness, patience for ourselves. And yet, how do we bring that to our family, even to our aging parents, you know, in the sandwich generation? Like, how do we do that when we can feel depleted and empty and when we need it the most, right? And so it just brings me back to where we started this whole thing. It's like, here we were, where you were like, in the moment you are right now, can you be mindful to know what you need? Like that moment to take a pause and say, what is it that will serve this moment, me, the person with me, like to the best that it could possibly be? And for me and my practice, that had to come from me sitting in meditation and learning how to do that so that I could do it in life. The greatest compassion I've ever given myself was to learn how to be mindful, alone and quiet, so that I could go into my relationships and how I interact in the world and do the same. But I had to give that to myself. I had to teach myself how to do that. It takes time and commitment. And to your point, Phil, it's not always easy what we see and what we find, you know, but over time, the more we do that alone, the easier it gets to do it in a relationship. Like with that feeling where you're talking about, can I come in? I do that regularly in conversations and interactions. I immediately scan what's happening in my body, how am I reacting, what's my emotional response, and I'm not afraid to pause anymore. I'm really not, because I know it will serve the conversation better. I know that it will ultimately serve me better, that I have less regrets for maybe reacting or saying something that I didn't want to say. We have to have that practice of mindfulness first here for us so we can bring it to others. That feels like the ultimate act of compassion. I know it's more than that, but it has to start there. Any thoughts on that?
This prompted my question. So how does my brain tell me, did you use
Terrible.
durable? Is my brain trying to keep me safe and loved? Just not clicking, okay.
Christine, you want to answer that? Are you asking the question about, is your mind just trying to be compassionate to you?
Yeah, so
In
like
some
those-
way, or-
like it's the self-criticism, not
Yes?
so not being compassionate to yourself, by calling yourself terrible and wrong. How does this and you said your mind always tries to keep itself safe and with feelings of love and
Right.
belonging. So what is my reaction?
Why is my mind being so mean to me?
Yes.
Because what it's doing and Al-Noor can correct me on this because I'm not the psychologist here. What our mind is doing is it is incorporating what we've learned from our parents. As children, we feel responsible. Mom's not happy. What have I done to make mom unhappy? What do I need to do to make mom happy? Phil, this isn't right. You're not acting the way you should. So it's telling me, it's letting me know, you made a mistake, Phil. You better do something about it. And we all have characteristic ways we act to compensate for our inadequacies. You don't say anything, you please and appease. You become the one who's out there demonstrating. Or yes, you become the drug addict, you become the alcoholic. So even though the words are mean, the intent is powerful. What do you think, Eleanor? Is there ways to help cultivate compassion for ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what we want to apply to a situation like that. I mean, even though this is what my mind is serving up to me, this is what my brain is telling me, that doesn't necessarily mean that's where it has to stop. And so I think this, again, going back to this theme that we had, right, where if I can be aware, oh, there's my mind talking to me, it's calling me names, telling me terrible things, right? There it also allows a space where I can say, okay, well, how can I, go back to your point, what can I do that would make this moment just a little easier for me? Let me start by introducing that piece of compassion. Maybe even it's a piece of compassion where I'm not going to necessarily buy that I'm a terrible person that my mind is telling me that I am. And then I could create some space around that language, around those words, around what it is that my mind is trying to tell me, because, and how is it trying to protect me? Does that make sense? How is it trying to protect me? What is the mechanism here? And you're right, I mean, you know, as a child, there is this tendency to blame oneself. And I won't go into the dynamics of that, that's a subject for a different conversation, but if I start there, if I can start with that awareness, then maybe I can offer myself something a little bit different. And then going back to that space that I create, this language that I use, calling myself terrible, that doesn't define me. And you know, you used this example earlier, right? And in mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, you know, we'll have this language, it's called inquiry, and we'll say, anger has arrived, right? Well, what does that language do? Well, it helps to create a bit of distance between this emotional experience that is mine. We're not talking about having an out-of-body experience or, you know, a psychotic break, right? It is my emotional experience, but there's a bit of distance that I can create between me and that emotion. Which means now I get to observe it, I get to be curious about it. And in that space, I can also be compassionate with it. Compassion with anger.
So are you referring to the notebook parts?
I think that mindfulness is about reparenting. Why? What do they say about mindfulness? Accept, allow, and what you are doing in being able to be present with your angry, thinking, critical mind. If you can create the space which is critical, then what you're saying to your child in an indirect way, you're okay, you're safe, and you're creating a new form of attachment that's positive for that wounded child. So mindfulness, I think this is what it does. that any parents are wounded is.
And in schema therapy, we would call that having a healthy adult within you that you need to speak to that.
We had Michael talking about internal family systems
There you go. There you go.
last time.
I also want to say that, you know, and you said this too, Al-Noor, that this is a practice. You know, that could come and it could be brief, and you could have saw it, but then still had reactivity and went the path of the spiral. But the next time, oh, like maybe just a little longer. And then maybe the next time just a little more. Like a little more, a little more, a little more, until like what Phil's saying, where suddenly there is more space for it all. Like, and it's almost like the set point starts to change within you. The more we offer that to ourselves, the more that grows. That way of being expands, at least it did for me. And then suddenly it was easier, and it was quicker, and it was longer, and I was like, oh, this. So, but it is that compassion to say, okay, I'm in it, and I'm learning, and I'm exploring. And that to me is the energy of compassion, to know that we can give ourselves the room to do it and make mistakes and not get it right the first time, but to remember and to come back to it. Any other thoughts or anything coming up?
Gives me more opportunities to be the silent observer rather than to be down there in the moment. But I'd like to say something about mindfulness. Be present. And try to, as best you can, try to get up above it a little bit so that you're observing you and the child, perhaps, if it's an interaction like that. So try to get up there, just to get enough distance so you can see them both at once. And I want to expand a little bit about being non-judgmental. That does not mean being disinterested or apathetic. For me, it is an opportunity to, I think I'm going to get some wisdom from this. And it's an opportunity for me to become more wise, because I'm not apathetic, I'm not disinterested, I'm not taking sides, but I am observing. And as best I can, I'm being very alert about where's the learning here. For example, I think we've all seen this. The child is been told, you're not going to play football in the backyard with Gramps today because I just put fertilizer on the grass. And a few minutes later, Benny is sitting on the stairs crying. His father comes to him. He says, Benny, don't cry. It's all right. Big boys don't cry. Don't cry, Benny. It's all right. And as I sit there in that position of being able to see them both, I see two things, or at least if this is an opportunity for wisdom, I see two things. I see Bennett's tears and crying as dismay and disappointment is pouring out of it's in excess, and it's pouring out of his eyes and the tears. And what I see in his father's behavior is, Benny, don't cry because it makes me uncomfortable. Benny, it's okay because I don't want this discomfort. Benny, big boys don't cry. I want you to stop this source of my discomfort. And so Benny's crying because he has an excess of dismay and disappointment, and his father's saying, don't cry because it makes me uncomfortable. Yeah. So there are opportunities for more wisdom if you stay alert and not stay alert and be that silent observer, but be an observer. Look for the opportunity to gain something from it. And so that's the great thing about being a grandparent, because I'm not in there saying, Benny, don't cry. I can watch his father say, Benny, don't cry. Thanks for that.
Yes, thank you.
Could I actually follow up on, because I'm a young father, I have a 2.5-year-old at home, and in those moments of, after a hard day's work, I'm exhausted, I'm very tired. I acknowledge the fact that I feel like it takes effort and energy to create that space for myself, to get present in that moment. I guess, excuse my ignorance with mindfulness and stuff, but if I do get into that present moment, will mindfulness reward me with energy to continue on progressing for the rest of the day?
I
As
love
opposed to
that
just throwing up the
question.
cartoons and just eliminating the tension moment.
I love that.
Because I do feel like it takes, and what you were saying with compassion and how it does get easier the more you practice. Because it does take effort to get down in the muck and not just try to cap the situation, but to see through my daughter's eyes on how she's feeling. So yeah, it's difficult for me because I'm exhausted at the end of the day, and I know that it takes that extra effort, but is there a way for me to practice and gain energy while being present with my child at home?
Yeah,
Yeah.
suck it up.
Yes.
Stop crying, Benny.
Maybe just let him do the talking.
This is great. This is like a wonderful question. Do you want to answer? I mean, I have some thoughts on it.
Please, I'll add to yours, that's okay.
Okay, my initial thinking is, it's always that airplane metaphor. It's like give yourself oxygen first. And what I find, if I could go somewhere, and maybe with your partner, where you say, look, I'm really tired, I just got in the door, I need 10 minutes, and go somewhere, get some quiet, find that space in yourself. And you can feel your tiredness, you can acknowledge all that's there, and then bringing in some breath practice, some invigoration into the body through the breath to enliven the body, and then actually come out and be like, okay. But that is that ability to listen in and say, you know what, I need this for myself so I can do this. And deciding how you work together as a family to be able to speak the truth. I mean, but you could have a partner that's like, I've been with our 2-year-old all day, it's like it's your turn now. So there's negotiations to be had and acknowledged, and truth for everyone. But I think you bring up a really valid point, is how do I serve myself so I can be in relationship with others? And I just offer that as an example to say, okay, how can I be here? Because I hear you wanting to be.
100%, yeah.
And that's so wonderful. That's really wonderful.
So yes, and yes. What I would say is, so I'm going to tie a few things here that we haven't actually touched on, so forgive me, and then we can have a conversation afterwards if I need to unpack this a bit more with you. Two competing lines here. So first, I think you'd be surprised how much energy you can have. Because your interest is energy. And your willingness and your wanting to participate is energy. And be careful of the language. If I tell myself I'm too tired, I can't do this, that then becomes a reality for me. And so I want to be careful of what I'm telling myself, how much I identify with the language that I use. That doesn't mean you shouldn't be tired. It just means maybe I tell myself I'm tired. I may not tell myself I'm too tired, but I am tired. And then when I give myself some space, if I can find some, even, quite frankly, even a minute or two sometimes, I can find a way of engaging. I will also say this, that we are energy systems. And so, again, I'll speak from my own personal experience. There is so much energy we get from a 2-year-old running up to us.
Yes.
So participate in that system and allow some of that energy to come your way. They're full of, right? They've got lots. They'll give you something, right? Maybe a little overwhelmingly so, right?
Yeah.
So we're systems too. And that goes back to the connectivity that we have and the way that we're wired to connect in that respect.
I love that.
Right? I'm so glad you asked. Thank you.
Do that pause in the car, in the driveway, not once you get inside.
That's grandfather wisdom.
That's actually very true. I like that. Yeah.
I think the bottom line, if I might just add one last thing, is bring mindfulness to the moment. In other words, if you're frustrated, angry, upset, happy, then you turn towards it, you name it, and you create the space by experiencing it, as Al-Noor has said, through the body. And then call your grandfather to come over and take care of the 2-year-old. Christine, she's talking.
So we're just gonna wrap up. Is there any final thoughts to feel complete? Yes.
There was a discussion about the fact that children learn from what we do, as opposed to what we say. In terms of, like, I'm going to go back to the negative talk about, like, feeling, like, saying I'm terrible. Where does that come from? Sometimes it comes from us, sometimes it comes from others in the society, like the school, and sometimes I find that there is additional intervention needed to speak or try to help to see that no, like, it's okay. And you need to say that it's not just like my behavior doesn't suffice or doesn't carry enough. So what can we do in that situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think you make a good point, right? So, maybe I can just start by saying, I think it's a little too stark to say they learn from what we do and not what we say. Of course, they learn from what we say. And it's a mixture of the two, but we are modeling. And so the way that we engage and the way that we are, and that is both behaviorally, it's verbal and nonverbal, has a huge impact. But for example, in situations where there's bullying or something like that, and that's not necessarily happening at home, it could be happening in school or in other aspects of that young child or that child's social environment. I think it's really important to acknowledge how difficult those moments are for that individual, for that child. And if there is a sense that, more is needed, then to reach out for that. That could be, reaching out to a psychologist or a therapist or something like that. That could also be, garnering the community if you have family and pulling in those resources. I think it's really important to acknowledge that, and important to acknowledge that mindfulness is not the panacea. It's not going to solve all problems. And sometimes you do need to do something in addition to. Does that, yeah?
Good. I think we feel complete. Okay. Thank you all for being here tonight. We look forward to seeing you again in December and first and third Thursday, so hope you can make it. And we are going to offer our gratitude to you, Al-Noor. Thank you for being here, and you, Phil, for the contributions tonight, and all of you for the discussion and your presence. So thank you for being here.
And Christine, you do things, talk about
I'm sorry.
talk about
Oh.
donations.
And most of you are aware of this, that we do donations at the door, but, you know, if you can't tonight, you can do it online or bring us another $5 next time you come. It's all good. Thank you. And we're just gonna pack up the chairs, so if you wanna help, we do stacks of 8, that's great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.